I am going to be discussing the CCR question 1, which is how does your product use or challenge social conventions and how does it represent social groups or issues? I would first like to talk about how we use conventions in our film. I'd like to think our film was kind of unconventional, but we did try to stick to some of the basics that you find in normal horror movies such as Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street. I want to focus on our use of reds, which may have gone unnoticed for parts of the film, but we did try to incorporate red into as much of the background as possible and really draw the viewer towards that color. We know from researching and learning in this class that red um, invokes a sense of fear and is kind of like a warning color, which we did want our viewer to notice. We also upped the saturation, which I'll talk about later, but that really makes the red stand out. Not only did we provide red in the backgrounds of our set, we also used it for some of the title cards. We didn't use it when we showed our names, we just used white for that. But for the opening scene, where it says 2B Productions Presents, we used red as it really contrasts with the background and it really does set it up as a horror film rather than just any other film, I suppose. But even looking at my research from earlier in the blog, where I looked at other title cards, most horror films tended to use red for these kinds of things, and I found that that was within conventions. Similarly, our title at the end of our introduction was red. Another convention that we stuck to was typical killer attire. So the four of us who worked in this group and our friend who helped were all girls, and none of us are buff or tall or super strong or something that you would normally think of when you do think of a killer in a film. So we had to make do with what we had. And what we chose to do was use dark outfits or dark clothes, so black pants, black shirt, black shoes, and a mask to conceal the identity of the killer, as well as a green jacket, which is it's kind of like a dingy unsaturated green that is wrinkled and bulky, as well as pants that aren't skin tight, they're kind of loose. And that baggy effect helps create that menacing look that none of us were able to naturally achieve. The mask also helps in concealing the identity of the killer, which is typical in most horror films. They're not just going to tell you who the killer is right off the bat. Moving on to our next choice in sticking to conventions is the cliche teen dialogue and style. As you may have noticed, the dialogue at the beginning of the film especially, and throughout the story that's being told, it's very typical for how teens in horror movies, or just movies in general, speak. I find that in a lot of parody horror movies, or we found that, sorry, like Scream and such, the teens speak very dramatically and over the top and kind of just it helps to accentuate the personalities that we chose for these characters. We also tried to style them to fit their personality in an over the top way, which I will get into soon. For my final bullet point in how we used conventions, it is the music and sounds. This is where we stuck most towards a typical horror movie film. Though we're just looking at pictures here, I will explain the sounds that were going on in each of these. In the top left corner with the window, that scene includes the killer's point of view and its heavy breathing, which I think is typical of a lot of horror movies. When you have a point of view shot of the killer, you get that like raspy, deep breathing, which we did request a guide to do, just since none of us were able to replicate that with our own voice. And in the bottom right corner, we have a picture of the killer in this one scene where there's a loud sort of um, sharp noise. I wouldn't even know what to categorize it as, but it is just a jarring sound that really, alarms you, followed by kind of ominous and fast-paced music. Um, and this is something that you will typically see in horror movies. We didn't use anything out of the ordinary here. Moving on to how we challenge conventions is the fact that we shot our film during the day. Now, this is the main point in how we challenge typical horror movies, but it is a major factor. Going into this, I did do a lot of research, almost coincidentally, on horror movies that were shot during the day. We weren't planning on this for most of the time, and by the end we were, but leading up to it when I was doing my research, I wasn't really thinking about that, though that did come in handy, obviously. One of these cases was I looked at the Mulholland Drive scene outside of a diner in which two characters are walking towards a dumpster and there's a jump scare. Um, but it's very frightening just because of how they use noise and lack of sight. And when I watched that movie, I found that to be really interesting, which is why I wrote about it. And I'm glad I did because it ended up coming into play in our film. This is not very typical. When you think of a horror movie, you don't think of blue skies and the sun being out and, just bright colors in general. You tend to think of more like gloomy and shadowy and almost hard to see images, um, from pictures. But we obviously didn't do that, and we had to make do with what we had since we knew we were gonna have to shoot it during the day. Um, we did this by first changing the color so that it still was sort of gloomy. It's a little bit green, which makes it a little bit unnatural. But it is still very bright. We did have the saturation high, so stuff like the red was still visible. Um, this also meant that we had to go through other means of hiding the killer since we couldn't hide them in the shadows. We had to hide them in broad daylight. So, we used the mask and the outfit to kind of conceal that, and we also used physical objects to like obscure your view of the killer. The broad daylight that we used in our film almost makes it feel more realistic towards the viewer since it's kind of like a situation that's like, oh, it's not just happening at night in this weird garage. It could happen during the day, and it just we had to play on that since we had to record during the day. Finally, I want to look at how we represented social groups or a social group, which is teenagers. We didn't really get to touch on social issues since this was a 2-minute horror film that wasn't very serious in nature and didn't have any commentary on a lot of the real world. I want to go from our characters from left to right, starting with Rena on the left, and just kind of go in depth on what we wanted their character to be and how we chose to represent them in this film. Rena was supposed to be very studious and nerdy and kind of like scared, and we showed this through her dialogue where she mentions wanting to keep studying and how she's like a little bit afraid of the conversation that we're having about the killer. We dressed her in like a nice jacket and shirt and pants just to make her look very business casual. On her left is Gabby, who we wanted to be a very soft, kind person, and we wanted her to wear white or a cardigan or something of the sort, and which is what she ended up doing, just so that she would contrast very well with the person sitting next to her, who is me. And my character was supposed to be like the mean, alternatively dressed, very, very stereotypical character in a lot of films that you may find. So I wore fishnets and all black, and I had safety pins in my shirt and dark makeup, and just kind of like overplayed that look of like, the grungy girl. And on my left is Alejandra, who was supposed to play the funny, like jokester kind of friend. So we had her just dress casually. We didn't want to do anything like super over the top since she's just a very casual character. Now we were aiming to represent teenagers since we knew that was our audience, and we wanted people to feel seen within this movie. And though we didn't really get to see much of each of the characters yet, we wanted people to be able to find a little bit of themselves in at least one of them. And with the super over-the-top dialogue and just how we dressed, we were hoping that we would be able to achieve that goal.